In the heart of a bustling city, inside a grand and prestigious courtroom, a dramatic case was unfolding. The city's elite had gathered, knowing that this trial would be one of the most high-profile of the year. The center of attention was Chadley Montgomery, a 25-year-old with a powerful family name. His father, Edgar Montgomery, was the CEO of one of the largest real estate empires in the country, making the Montgomerys one of the wealthiest families in the city. But Chadley had spent most of his life living in the shadow of his family's fortune, and it had made him arrogant and reckless. Chadley had been in trouble before, but nothing as serious as this. He had been arrested multiple times for drunk driving, assault, and violent outbursts in public, but every time, his family's money and connections had helped him escape real consequences. Lawyers were always ready to cover up his mistakes, and his father's influence ensured that the press would be kept quiet. Chadley believed that his family's wealth meant he could do anything without ever facing punishment. But this time, it was different. Chadley had gone too far. He had been involved in a violent altercation at a nightclub, during which he resisted arrest and made racist comments towards a group of people. The incident was widely witnessed, and there were multiple recordings of his behavior. The damage had already been done, and his usual tactics wouldn't work this time. The case landed in front of Judge Cassandra Barnes, a woman known for her sharp mind, strong convictions, and no-nonsense approach to the law. She was the kind of judge who believed in fairness and would not let anyone, regardless of their status, use wealth to avoid accountability. This was Chadley's first real taste of justice, and he wasn't ready for it. Chadley was used to walking into rooms and getting whatever he wanted, but Judge Barnes wasn't the kind of person to be intimidated. As the trial began, it was clear that Chadley wasn't planning on taking the charges seriously. He acted as though he was above it all, looking down on everyone in the courtroom, including the judge. The lawyers representing him did their best to argue that he was simply a young man making mistakes. But Chadley's actions were about to show just how much he thought the law didn't apply to him. As the proceedings continued, Chadley couldn't resist making snide comments and trying to undermine Judge Barnes' authority. He mocked her appearance by calling her just another angry woman trying to make a point, and even laughed openly at her when she spoke. He couldn't fathom that someone like her, someone without his wealth or influence, could be in charge. His behavior only got worse from there, and it was becoming clear that he had no respect for the court or the law. Judge Barnes was calm and professional, but everyone in the courtroom could see that she was getting fed up with his disrespect. She had been a judge for years and had faced many difficult defendants, but Chadley's sense of entitlement was beyond anything she had ever encountered. As the case progressed, Chadley's words grew harsher, and it was becoming impossible to ignore his intention to make a mockery of the justice system. Chadley's arrogance seemed to grow with every passing minute. As Judge Barnes carefully reviewed the evidence against him, Chadley continued to show utter disrespect for her and the entire courtroom. He had already dismissed her authority, and now, he was ready to cross the line. During a quiet moment in the trial, when Judge Barnes was speaking to the prosecutor, Chadley leaned back in his chair and loudly scoffed. He began making fun of the judge's attire, calling it too conservative and too old-fashioned for someone in a courtroom. He mocked her hairstyle, calling it outdated, and made crude comments about her age and appearance. His classmates from his privileged college days might have found this funny, but in the courtroom, it was clear that no one was laughing. Judge Barnes, while visibly uncomfortable with the comments, remained composed and focused. She warned him several times that disrespecting the court would not be tolerated. But Chadley wasn't listening. He didn't think there were any consequences to his behavior. He truly believed that his family's wealth and status meant he was untouchable. His behavior took an even darker turn when, during a break in the proceedings, he got up and grabbed a drink from the table. With a defiant smile, he hurled it across the room, causing it to splash on the floor in front of the judge. "This whole system is rigged!" he shouted, not caring that everyone in the room could hear him. "You think this is justice? You think you can judge me? I'm Chadley Montgomery. My family owns this town." The courtroom gasped. People exchanged shocked looks, some quietly murmuring in disbelief. It wasn't just the outburst itself, but the complete disregard for the rules of decorum and respect. What Chadley didn't realize was that he was breaking the law, not just with his actions, but with his blatant refusal to follow basic courtroom rules. Throwing drinks, making racist comments, and shouting at the judge were violations of court conduct, and they wouldn't be ignored. Judge Barnes, who had kept her cool up until this point, finally had enough. She paused the proceedings and stood up, her eyes never leaving Chadley. "You are in a court of law, Mr. Montgomery. This is not a place for your antics or your wealth to protect you. You will be held accountable for your behavior." Chadley, of course, didn't seem to care. He smirked and leaned back in his chair, confident that his family's money would get him out of this. But this time, things were different. The actions he had taken had pushed the limits, and the person who would have to pay for it was him. Chadley Montgomery, feeling increasingly invincible in the courtroom, began to act like he was untouchable. His belief that no one could challenge him, especially someone like Judge Barnes, grew stronger with each passing minute. Up until this point, his outbursts and disrespect had already caused chaos, but he wasn't finished yet. Instead of realizing the severity of his actions, Chadley decided to escalate things to an entirely new level. In the middle of the ongoing trial, as Judge Barnes was speaking to the prosecutor, Chadley pulled out his cell phone. Without any hesitation, he started filming the judge, making mocking faces and laughing at her. He zoomed in on her as she was speaking, twisting his face into exaggerated expressions. It was obvious to everyone in the courtroom that he was trying to make her a joke, as if he were the star of a prank video. But the act itself was no joke. It was an open disruption of the trial, an attempt to humiliate the judge publicly. Chadley didn't stop there. With a smirk on his face, he hit "Go Live" on his social media account and began broadcasting the scene to his followers. On screen, Chadley pointed his phone directly at Judge Barnes, whispering in the microphone, "This is what you get when a wannabe judge tries to mess with someone who doesn't even care about the law. Look at her trying to act tough. It's all a joke." As Chadley's mocking remarks rang out across the courtroom, his followers began to comment, laughing at his antics. His live video quickly gained traction, and soon dozens, then hundreds, of people were watching his disrespectful broadcast. He even added captions like, "Angry lady of color trying to hold me down," and "She's out of her league. Come on, we all know how this ends." The entire courtroom was now aware of what was happening. The prosecutor, the defense attorney, and even the other witnesses were all staring at Chadley, shocked at his brazen disregard for the law. Judge Barnes, however, remained calm and composed, her eyes fixed on Chadley as his phone continued recording. What he didn't realize, or perhaps didn't care about, was that what he was doing was not just childish, it was illegal. By filming the court proceedings without permission, Chadley had tampered with the legal process. Recording in a courtroom was a violation of state law, and doing so with the intent to mock and discredit the judge was contempt of court. His attempt to embarrass Judge Barnes publicly wasn't just rude, it was an obstruction of justice. He had crossed the line from reckless behavior to a criminal act. Chadley had just committed a serious violation, and now, the consequences would be even more severe. He thought he was untouchable, that his wealth and connections could get him out of anything. But the truth was that he had just set himself up for a major downfall. His actions had turned his already messy legal situation into a disaster. While his phone's camera kept streaming to his social media, the damage he had done to his own case was irreversible. His earlier antics were childlike and irresponsible, but what he was doing now was outright illegal. There was no turning back. Judge Cassandra Barnes had seen many defendants try to avoid the consequences of their actions, but none had tested her patience quite like Chadley Montgomery. His behavior had been outrageous, but now, it had crossed into illegal territory. With the courtroom in complete chaos and everyone's attention on Chadley's live stream, Judge Barnes stood up. She paused for a long moment, letting the room fall silent. It was clear she was about to make a decision that would have a lasting impact, not just on Chadley, but on everyone in that courtroom. After a brief recess, Judge Barnes reconvened the trial, her eyes sharp and focused. Chadley was still arrogantly scrolling through his phone, blissfully unaware of the consequences now headed his way. She looked at him, a calm but firm expression on her face, and announced her decision. "I've been patient with you, Mr. Montgomery. You've tested the limits of respect in this courtroom, but you've now crossed a line that cannot be ignored. Your actions today, from disrespecting the court to your public attempt to humiliate this judicial system, are not just a violation of decorum, they are a direct assault on the integrity of this court and our legal system." The room was dead quiet. Chadley looked up, still confident that somehow his wealth would protect him, but his smirk faded when Judge Barnes continued. "I have decided that, due to your contempt of court, obstruction of justice, and your blatant attempt to disrupt a public legal proceeding, you will be sentenced to 15 years in prison. This sentence reflects the seriousness of your actions and sends a message that no one is above the law, no matter how rich or influential they think they are." The courtroom was in complete shock. No one had expected this kind of sentence. Even the prosecutor, who had prepared for a routine verdict, was stunned into silence. Chadley's defense attorney nearly choked on his own words, completely caught off guard. "This can't be real," he muttered, looking at the judge with disbelief. He had expected a fine, maybe a slap on the wrist, but not this. The room was silent, save for the low murmur of people trying to process what had just been said. For Chadley, the world seemed to tilt. He had been certain that his family's money and reputation would get him out of trouble. He had laughed off the warnings and the subtle threats from Judge Barnes, thinking they were just part of the show. But this was no show. This was a real, life-altering decision. He stared at Judge Barnes, his confident facade crumbling. "No, wait! You can't do this!" he shouted, but it was too late. The gavel came down with a sharp bang, signaling the end of his freedom. Chadley Montgomery's actions had gone from mischief to felony, and now, he was facing the consequences. His wealth couldn't protect him. His family's power couldn't save him. And now, for the first time in his life, Chadley had no one to turn to, except the reality of a long prison sentence. Chadley Montgomery's world quickly crumbled after his actions in the courtroom. When the video of his disrespectful and racist outburst went viral, it spread like wildfire across social media. People were furious. His mocking gestures, the racist comments, and his blatant disregard for Judge Barnes were no longer just a courtroom issue, they became a public spectacle. The video was shared, commented on, and criticized by thousands of people across the country. It wasn't just the people who knew him who were angry. People everywhere saw him as a symbol of privilege gone wrong. The outrage that followed was immense. Social media was flooded with hashtags calling for justice, demanding that Chadley be held accountable for his actions. People pointed out how wealth and privilege allowed someone like him to act as if he was untouchable, mocking a judge simply because she was a black woman. Many called for a reform in how the legal system dealt with wealthy individuals who thought they could buy their way out of consequences. The video raised questions about systemic inequality, racial discrimination, and how money often gave people an unfair advantage, allowing them to escape punishment for actions that would have destroyed the lives of ordinary citizens. For the Montgomery family, things quickly went from bad to worse. Chadley's father, who ran a massive real estate empire, faced pressure from every direction. Investors were worried about how the scandal would affect their reputation. The media was relentless, and stories about Chadley's behavior and his family's attempts to protect him flooded the news. The Montgomerys, who once thought of themselves as untouchable, were now facing public disgrace. Chadley's mother, who had always shielded him from the consequences of his actions, was devastated. She couldn't believe that her son's behavior had destroyed not only his future but potentially the family's business empire as well. It was clear to her that their wealth and influence couldn't protect them anymore. The public's loss of faith in the Montgomerys hit them hard, and the family was forced to answer questions they had never thought they would face. The Montgomery name, once associated with power and success, was now synonymous with arrogance and disrespect. The scandal was more than just an embarrassment, it was a wake-up call. The world saw how unchecked privilege could allow someone like Chadley to act with no regard for others, and the public demanded change. Chadley's actions were a mirror reflecting the flaws in society, and now, the consequences of those actions were reaching far beyond just one person. Chadley Montgomery, once a young man who thought his wealth and family name could shield him from any consequence, was now forced to face a harsh new reality. After being sentenced to 15 years in prison, Chadley found himself in an environment that was completely foreign to him. The world that had once revolved around his family's connections, his luxury lifestyle, and his sense of superiority was gone. The prison walls, the strict rules, and the constant threat of danger were all part of a world where money meant nothing. For the first time, Chadley couldn't rely on his parents or his friends. There were no private lawyers or high-end accommodations to shield him from the harsh truths of his situation. He was just another inmate. The other prisoners didn't care who his family was. They didn't care about his wealth. They saw him for what he had become, a spoiled young man who thought he could break the law without facing any real consequences. Chadley's time in prison wasn't easy. At first, he tried to maintain his usual cocky attitude, but that didn't last long. The environment was tough, and the constant pressure made him rethink his approach to life. He began to reflect on how he had lived his life before, the things he had said, the people he had hurt, and the disrespect he had shown to those who didn't have his privileges. The reality check he had been given was painful, but it was also a moment of growth. Slowly, Chadley started to realize the gravity of his actions, and his arrogance began to fade. Inside those prison walls, he was forced to confront something he had never thought about before: the consequences of his behavior. His actions hadn't just affected Judge Barnes, but they had also disrespected the legal system and the idea that everyone should be treated equally. Chadley began to understand that his privileged life had shielded him from the truth of the world around him. He had been able to mock people, belittle them, and break the law without facing consequences because he didn't think anyone could stop him. But now, in prison, that illusion was shattered. As time passed, Chadley began to change. He started reading books, learning about the history of race, justice, and the struggles of those who didn't have the luxury of privilege. He began speaking to other inmates, many of whom had been victims of an unjust system, and listening to their stories. The arrogance that had once defined him started to give way to humility and remorse. Chadley knew he could never undo the damage he had caused, but he began to work toward becoming someone who understood the true meaning of accountability. While Chadley's actions could never be fully forgiven, his transformation during his time in prison marked a turning point. The arrogant young man who had mocked Judge Barnes and believed he could escape consequences was gone. In his place was a man who had learned the hard way that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, was above the law. And though he would carry the weight of his mistakes for the rest of his life, Chadley began to rebuild himself, one step at a time.